Will more of the top 2024 NFL draft prospects skip the combine workouts? And how will it affect the Falcons draft board?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering this Falcons team for far too long, almost 20 years. Formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And on today's episode, we will be talking about the importance of the combine, right? And we'll talk about it, sort of break it down by position group, right? We'll talk about sort of the importance of the agility tests for edge rushers. We'll talk about why I'm going to be paying close attention to the 40-yard dash times for wide receivers. Also, we'll talk a little bit about why, free agency is not necessarily going to be the solution to the Falcons' wide receiver problems. But we'll start off things talking about sort of the top, prospects potentially skipping this year's combine and how that may affect the Falcons draft board. But, before we jump right into that, I do want to give a shout out to the everydayers, right, that make this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day, first watch as well. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, guys, is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, we've already gotten word. The combine is going to start. I think workouts start on Friday. We'll get Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris speaking on Thursday. So we'll get, we'll see what we can glean from those 5 to 10 minute pressers that they're going to do on Thursday later this week. And as the week unfolds, we'll probably talk more about sort of specific players in combine. But, today I like to do these general overview type of episodes each year as a reminder. But let's start off talking about sort of the top 3 guys. Potentially the players that could be 1, 2, and 3 in this draft have already opted out of doing on-field work and the potential drills already in the combine. We'll see who else. And those players I'm referring to are Caleb Williams of USC, the quarterback out of USC, Jayden Daniels, the quarterback out of LSU, and Marvin Harrison, the wide receiver out of Ohio State. Marvin Harrison Jr., I should stress. There's a scenario where those guys go 1, 2, and 3 in this draft, and they've already let it be known that they're not going to be doing any of the combine stuff. They'll be there. They'll interview with teams and whatnot. But we see this commonly happen. Many of the top prospects do opt out of the combine stuff. So it's not surprising that these guys in particular. I'll be curious about some of the other guys, particularly at their respective positions, like quarterback Drake May out of UNC, quarterback J.J. McCarthy out of Michigan, Malik Neighbors, the wide receiver out of LSU, Roma Dunze, the wide receiver out of Washington. All these guys are potentially on the Falcons' radar to be the possible pick at pick number 8. We'll talk a little bit more about the edge rushers that are also in the mix there a little bit later in the episode. But, it's interesting. We were hoping that the precedent that CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson kind of set last year, where they were the rare, highly drafted guys or expected to be highly drafted guys that did throw at the combine. Bryce Young did opt out. That doesn't seem to be carrying over. I'm not expecting May to throw at the combine. I'm hopeful that McCarthy might throw, but I think there are reasons why McCarthy might throw, and it'll be interesting with like Daniels and McCarthy in particular, because when we talk about the combine, it's a similar conversation that we had last year with Bryce Young. Like, part of the reason why Bryce Young, it was speculated. Again, this is not confirmed, but it was widely speculated that one of the reasons why Bryce Young chose not to do any of the on-field and drill work at the combine was because he had been spending the weeks leading up to the combine adding mass, right? Getting up to weight, and he wasn't necessarily comfortable working out at that weight. And, it's widely speculated that by the time he got to his pro day several weeks later, he had dropped a lot of the mass that he'd been put on. And that matters for guys like Jayden Daniels and J.J. McCarthy, because that is a concern about their games, right? That Jayden Daniels is listed at like 6'4", 210. So we'll see what he measures in. But that's a very similar size to Desmond Ridder, who's also, a pretty skinny quarterback. And that matters for Jayden Daniels just because of the wear and tear that he potentially is going to take on his body, especially given his ability as a runner. And the likelihood that an NFL team that drafts Jayden Daniels is going to lean on that running ability early in his NFL career. Again, it may not be something that they spam, where they're running him like 12 plus times a game, but it is something that you'll probably see. And you do wonder a little bit about his ability to hold up with that type of, because typically guys that are his height, 6'4", typically are like 220, 225. So typically have 10 to 15 more pounds. So it'll be interesting to see where Jayden Daniels weighs in at. I would guess, he can be as heavy as he needs to be because he's not going to run. So he doesn't need to be light in order to run fast. So, I guess, 212 would probably be ideal, but he could push it to 218 or something like that if he really wants to. So that would be something interesting. And then JJ McCarthy, is not going to necessarily be a runner, but he's pretty light, right? He's listed at 202, according to Michigan. And usually these college websites are padding the numbers. They're padding a couple of inches on the height and a couple of, 5 to 10 pounds on the weight. And so I've seen people speculating about whether JJ McCarthy was, sub 200, similar to Bryce Young last year, right? The Bryce Young stuff with the height was an issue, but, in a post Russell Wilson era, like we've seen that NFL teams don't ding guys for height, but they still kind of ding guys for weight, at least in terms of being sub 200. So it'll be interesting to see what JJ McCarthy weighs in at. And for that reason, that may prevent him from doing any of the on-field work and drill work, because like Bryce Young, he's been getting those gains up, as they say, to try to get up to 208 or higher at his size or whatever. So we'll see what those guys do in terms of their on-field work. Obviously for the Falcons, particularly at the quarterback position, they're going to care a lot more about the interviews than what they do on field, but it would be nice to see some of these guys throw, like Jayden Daniels, like JJ McCarthy, the guys that weren't at the Senior Bowl back in January and February. So we'll see what that has to do. But it has been reported that many of the day two guys, like the Michael Penix Jr.'s, Bo Nix, Spencer Rattler, the guys that were at the Senior Bowl, I know Penix has already confirmed that he's gonna throw. So I would assume those other guys are also going to throw, because they're not top 10, top 15 locks like some of these other guys. So it'll be interesting to see how, whether or not some of these guys work out and what they do. But like typically, if you're considered to be a top 10, top 15 lock, and a lot of guys we're talking about, like Malik Neighbors and Roma Dunze and Jayden Daniels, etc., Drake May, are locks to be picked that high. So it's not going to really hurt or help or hurt them. I mean, it potentially actually could hurt their stock probably more by working out. At least that's the general perception, because if they don't test well, then teams will be like, oh, he's not good, right? And teams will insist, oh, we only rely on the film. But like in a lot of ways, at certain key positions, like testing does matter. Now, quarterbacks, I don't know if it matters nearly as much, because it's going to be about what they do in the interview room. But if you're a quarterback, part of the reason why guys skip the combine is because they want to put their best foot forward, right? And you can typically do that at the pro day because you can control that. You've been working out with those receivers. They're often receivers that you've been throwing to, in college, if not guys that you've been working out in the pre-draft process, as opposed to at the combine where they're all strangers to you, right? They're all the other wide receivers that, are working out. And, when JJ McCarthy is throwing to Roman Wilson, his wide receiver at Michigan, okay, he has a rapport with that guy. Jayden Daniels, if he throws to Malik Neighbors or Brian Thomas, he's fine for that guy. But for everybody else, the other 29 35, whatever, how many receivers that are going to be at the combine. Like, they don't have that sort of rapport and that timing. And so you're not allowed to put your best foot forward. So that's the reason why agents basically tell their clients to opt out of throwing at the combine. So, NFL teams are at a point now where they expect it, but we'll see on those fronts. But, one thing that the combine is famous, and depending on who you ask, infamous for, is the 40-yard dash. And I'm going to break down why I'll be paying much closer attention to the 40 times of the wide receivers this year, and why free agency may not be the path to salvation for the Falcons at that wide receiver position as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, I want to tell you that today's episode of Locked On Falcons is sponsored by BetterHelp. And a lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. I know I'm going to be wishing that I had more time later this offseason as I'm trying to grind out more film of these prospects. But, how would you use your extra time? Is a better way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can do more of it. Therapy has benefited me. BetterHelp has benefited me by, teaching me coping skills. Like, I can only control what I can control. I can't control who the Falcons draft. I can't control if the Falcons win on Sundays, but I can control, the quality of this podcast. And at least according to some of you, not necessarily everybody in the comments, you appreciate the quality of this podcast. And so if you're looking to find similar coping skills and thinking of starting therapy, I highly recommend giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist. And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app, right? Locked On Sports Today, as well as Locked On Sports Atlanta if you're looking for more local flavor. All part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I care quite a bit about 40 times, right? And at some point, I'm going to be breaking into wide receiver film on the Locked On Falcons Insiders. I'm going to do a Jayden Daniels film breakdown later this week. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider so that you can get that, by all means, hit the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You'll get access to that. You get the one-on-one connection with me. As well as I'm probably be sending out my thoughts on various combine testing throughout the weekend. But I'm going to care a lot about wide receivers because next week, I'm going to start breaking into the wide receiver film. I'm not sure if I'll do breakdowns next week on some of the top wide receivers. We might start looking at free agents that the Falcons might sign with that sort of looming starting next week. But I definitely care about the 40 times, right? And I've joked with folks that basically, in terms of wide receiver prospects for the Falcons, if you don't run a 4.42 or faster, then I don't want you here. We've talked a lot about the need for this team to get much faster at the wide receiver position. I hope that's something that they prioritize this offseason. But my plan right now, my tentative plan right now, is I'm going to watch like 20 plus wide receivers starting next week, right? And how long that takes, we'll sort of see. There's 17 wide receivers currently ranked in Dayton Brugler of the Athletics top 100, right? There are 3 more guys in Pro Football Focus's top 100. So that puts you at 20, right? But, some of those guys, I do plan on watching all 20 of those guys, but if any of them run like a 4.45 or something like that, I'm sorry, not a 4.45, a 4.55, I should stress, not a 4.45, a 4.55, then I might just watch one game and then move on to the next guy because I'm just like, I don't want you, right? Now, if there are some other guys that are like not considered to be top 100 guys at this juncture, but they run, like a 4.36 or something like that, then I would probably add them to the list. That's why I say 20 plus, because, that list might swell depending on what guys run in terms of clocking fast 40. So I'll add those guys to the list as well. So, talked before, the Falcons are likely to invest significant resources at the wide receiver position. I think the consensus is that after quarterback and edge rusher, it's probably the biggest need for this team. And, we'll see what they do in free agency first and foremost, right? Because right now they only have 2 wide receivers on the roster in terms of Drake London and Josh Ali are the only guys currently under contract. Maybe a couple of future contracts guys that they signed off the practice squad. But Van Jefferson, Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller, Kadero Hodge are all free agents. And any one of those guys or multiple of those guys could return. But you could imagine with a new coaching staff in the building, you're expecting kind of an overhaul at that wide receiver position, right? From what Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot have built the last couple of years. And that could potentially lead not only to the Falcons going after free agent wide receivers, but also double and or triple dipping when it comes to the draft, not just drafting one receiver, right? So, we'll see what the Falcons do at that position. But, I want to have, basically what I'm saying is I want to have a deeper knowledge of this wide receiver class and ultimately probably wind up watching 25 or more guys in the pre-draft process so that, I know who those guys are that are in the mix in the top 10, which is basically, we know Marvin Harrison's probably going to be off the board, but Malik Neighbors and Roma Dunse, and then who are going to be those guys on day 2, who are going to be those guys on day 3, if the Falcons do wind up double and triple dipping at the position. So we'll see how that goes. But in terms of free agency, right, I know there's going to be a push for the Falcons to go out there and be aggressive in free agency at the wide receiver position because they need bodies there. But, I don't know if the solution to their problem is in free agency, right? Like in terms of finding that guy that you can line up opposite Drake London long term, like that to me is a drafted player, not a free agent pickup, right? Because historically speaking, signing receivers in free agency isn't necessarily a path to getting, high-end receivers, right? We know that free agency tends to only allow the mid-level players, no offense, but the most Sanus of the world, right? The guys that you sign to be number 2s, but they wind up being number 3s, that sort of guy. Like you can find a Mo Sanu on the market. You can find a Mac Hollins on the market. You can find Scotty Miller on the market. But in terms of like those high-end players, and like you don't historically see a lot of free agent signings go to new teams at the wide receiver position and have these huge impacts, right? If you look at, a lot of certainly in today's NFL, but this goes back years, so it's not unique to today. But when you look at a lot of the impact players at wide receivers that change teams, it's almost always guys that get traded, right? Not guys that sign in free agents. Like you look at Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, right? These are all guys that have changed teams in the last couple of years and had very big impacts on the teams that they've, gone to, but they all got traded. And when you look at specifically this past 2023 season, and you just go by who was the most productive receiver that wasn't a trade guy, right? It's like DeAndre Hopkins, who prior to signing with the Titans was traded to the Arizona Cardinals. So again, it fits the paradigm. And Adam Thielen, right? And after that, it's Jacoby Myers. After that, it's Christian Kirk. And that's what I mean, where it's like, yeah, you can find the most Sanu type of players in free agency, but beyond that, so if the Falcons are not going to rely on the draft to find their number 2 or their, whether you think Drake London's the 1 or the 2 or whatever, but that sort of partner, that long-term partner for Drake London in the draft, trade markets out there, Devontae Adams might be shopped this offseason. Brandon Ayuk might be shopped this offseason if the 49ers aren't keen on paying him, right? And of course, we know that it's time for me to dust off the Hunter Renfrow agenda from last year. We went very quiet on Hunter Renfrow, starting in August last year. And so we need to start dropping his name this offseason to get that ball rolling again, like we were doing all last offseason. So, there are options for the Falcons if they do want to trade for a wide receiver that, in Ayuk's case, you're going to have to pay him. Renfrow's case, you're probably going to have to redo his deal. And Adams's case, you just have to, take that contract on the chin. But, that's all I'll say is just like there's a buyer's beware when it comes to making a splurge on free agent wide receivers. So, we'll see what unfolds in the coming weeks for the Falcons at that position. But, the other position of priority is that edge rusher position. And I'll be paying attention to the testing at this weekend's combine, and I'll break down why the 3-cone might be the most important drill for evaluating edge rushers as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, football season is over, but it means basketball season is going strong, and that means you guys can get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your first bet wins. Bet on your favorite NBA, NCAA teams coming up with March Madness. You can do quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive player props, all that and more. Not only the NBA, NCAA, but NHL, NFL draft, right? If you want to take a flyer on who you think is going to win the Super Bowl next year, hey, that's available for you at FanDuel. You can find anything over at FanDuel. All you got to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot. FanDuel is an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. So more combine, draft, and free agent content coming your way as your first listen. So continue to subscribe to Locked On Falcons. Let's get to 10,000 subscribers, guys. We broke 9,000. Let's, if you're haven't subscribed to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, by all means, go do that so we can get to 10,000. But we'll revisit a topic now that I've talked about in the past when we do these combine previews. I think I've done it like 2 years in a row now. So if you're, an everydayer of the podcast, especially for those of you that's one of the 9,000 subscribers, you've heard this before, but it's a refresher for any of you that's new or, any of you that's old, right? So in the past, I've gone back and looked at the testing of every edge rusher taken in the first 2 rounds, right? And we'll focus primarily on the first round today since 2010, right? And I looked at height, weight, arm length, 40 time, 3-cone, short shuttle, and broad jump. And I compare that to their sack production, right, to sort of see which of those metrics correlates the most to on-field production. And let's be clear, correlation is not causation. And these correlations aren't like super high, right, when it comes to this. But the few metrics that do have a decent correlation to sack production are the 3-cone and a short shuttle, right? And intuitively, looking at the agility drills does make sense, right? Because they affect change of direction. They're really talking about bend, right? And when you're typically when you're edge rusher, the easiest path, or easy may be the wrong word, but the quickest path to the quarterback is to use your speed to be able to beat that offensive tackle around the corner, that bending ability. And just because you have a great 3-cone does not guarantee that you're going to be a super productive NFL pass rusher. That's why I say, there are decent correlations, but they're not like 1-to-1 or anything like that, right? Because if you go back over the last 14 years, some of the best edge rushers in round 1 that had great 3-cones didn't turn into productive pass rushers in the NFL. Guys like Solomon Thomas, guys like Barkevious Mingo, Bruce Irvin, Derek Barnett, Vic Beasley. But you do have guys like TJ Watt and Von Miller and Aiden Hutchinson that had extremely good 3-cone times and turned so far, we'll see what Aiden Hutchinson does, but Miller and Watt are Hall of Famers. I don't think that's a spicy take for me to say. And we'll see if Aiden Hutchinson goes down that same road. He's off to a very promising start is what we'll say. But I do think these 3-cones do matter because it can help kind of break ties where it's like you might have 3 guys or more guys stacked on your draft board with similar grades. And you're like, okay, well, this guy is our priority because this guy has that sort of change of direction and agility that we're looking for that suggests that he may have that sort of bend, that can make him into a productive pass rusher. And particularly for the Falcons, when there are 3 sort of top edges that depending on who you ask, who's their edge 1, you look at Dallas Turner of Alabama, Jared Verse of Florida State, and Laiatu Latu of UCLA, I think which one of these guys tests best in the 3-cone could go a long way to determining, okay, if you're the Falcons and you're probably in a position to take the top edge in this draft class at 8, the 3-cone might matter in that regard. That might help you better stack your board. So what's other interesting in doing this research is that this doesn't really apply to non-first round picks, right? When I did this for second round picks, it wasn't the 3-cone that was particularly correlative to on-field production. It was the short shuttle instead, right? And part of that is due to some of the more productive second round edge rushers of the last 14 years. For example, DeMarcus Lawrence had a bad 3-cone. He got a bombed the 3-cone, but he had a very good short shuttle. And DeMarcus Lawrence is one of the more productive, on-field, pass rushers in terms of sacks of the last 14 years. That was taken around too. And so that's part of the reason. Carlos Dunlap's another guy that didn't test well in the agilities, but has been very productive pass rusher relative to most second round picks. And that's what kind of throws off the data. So, we'll see on this year's crop of edge rushers in terms of how they test. I'm personally expecting Dallas Turner and Chop Robinson out of Penn State to kind of light it up at the combine, assuming they work out. Turner could skip it. We'll see. I would not assume Robinson will, unless there's an injury or something like that. But it doesn't, as we discussed earlier, like Robinson is potentially a first round pick, but probably not a top 10 or top 15 pick. Another edge rusher that I'm very curious to see how he tests is Darius Robinson out of Missouri, who was at the Senior Bowl, and watching his film, I question his ability to have that sort of bend. And that's part of the reason why I see him more as a 5-tech, 4-eye sort of interior D lineman than a true edge rusher. But I'll be very curious to see how he tests in that regard. And maybe that, makes me think, oh, okay, maybe the athleticism is, better than what I initially gave it credit for. But we'll see. Now, I haven't done a deep dive on the edge rushers yet this year. That's probably going to come, later in March after I get through the receivers and going into April or whatever. But at the same time, as I'm looking at some of these top guys that could be in the mix for the Falcons in the early rounds, it's also worthwhile to me to see how some of these guys test, because you're looking for some like day 3 sort of flyers that you can take where, some of these mid to late round guys that test well, that you're just going to bet on the traits. And the, two prime examples of guys that teams were willing to bet on the traits outside the top 100, Trey Hendrickson and Max Crosby in recent years that teams were willing to bet on, and they have turned into two of the more productive pass rushers in the NFL in recent years. And so that's also something to keep an eye on, that I'll be keeping an eye on. So sort of like, okay, we kind of know who the top guys are, or expected to be the top guys are, but who are some of these other guys that are also combine invites that aren't really considered to be like top 100 picks, so not in the mix for the Falcons in the first 3 rounds. Who are maybe some of those guys, if the Falcons choose to double dip, that they can take a flyer on in round 4 or round 5 or whenever, that, may work out down the road. So we'll see how that goes, guys. Those are my thoughts, at least in terms of, the sort of, I guess, the big 3 positions that we'll be focused on in the combine: quarterbacks, edges, and wide receivers. We'll break down more stuff combine related, as well as any other Falcons adjacent narratives as the week unfolds. We'll see if we can get some guests as well before they break into combine. Unfortunately, all the good guests are headed to Indianapolis, and they're all traveling in the next day or two. So I don't know if I'll be able to get any of those guys. I need to find, somebody else like me that's, a homebody that ain't going anywhere close to Naptown. So we'll see how that goes, but continue to check out Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Check out Locked On Falcons Insiders by joining the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/Locked On Falcons, so you can get that Jayden Daniels film breakdown, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month after that. So you'll get Jayden Daniels, you'll get Caleb Williams. I've already done Drake May, J.J. McCarthy, as well as Michael Penix Jr. We'll see what else is in store. We'll kind of play it by ear. As we get into free agency, I do plan on doing some breakdowns on any free agent pickups that the Falcons wind up doing. So that will be something also in store for you guys in the future if you want to sign up as well. But, make sure you check out Locked On NFL. Locked On NFL Draft, of course, is going to have great coverage all week long on the combine as well, with Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports today. Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta is going to Indy, so that's another great place for some great combine coverage. Of course, it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.